Previously, you've taken notes on amplitude. Today, add period to your notes as well, because that's going to be the main theme of this section that we're going into, is working with period while also practicing things like amplitude and midline. Once you have that down to your notes, go ahead and proceed. So here we have a graph that's already been completed for us, and we're being asked to find the midline, amplitude, and period of this graph. First up, the midline. Having those dotted lines drawn in for us here at the start makes our lives so much easier, because you can actually just see where the midline is here. The midline is going through up here at 2. So our midline here is going to be at 2. Now, when we write the midline, we don't just write 2 though. The midline is a line, of course, and so we're actually going to write y equals 2, because that then makes it the equation of a horizontal line. Next up, the amplitude. The amplitude, remember, is the distance from the midline to the top or the bottom of our graph. So it's going to be one of those two distances there. And notice both distances are the same. They both are 3, so our amplitude is 3. And yes, we go ahead and we write it just that way. And then next up is the period, though. The period, according to our definition, is basically the width of a wave. How long does it take to complete one full cycle? And you notice in this example here, if we start over here at the far left for our count, we start in the middle and then we go up, middle, bottom, middle. So this is really how long it took to complete one full cycle. It's back to where it's going to start repeating itself. And so our period then is that width. So we're then saying how far is it from negative 360 to a positive 360 degrees. And so if we do 360 minus negative 360, that gives us 720 degrees. And so that's the period. It's how long it took to start repeating itself. All right, next example. Same 3 questions, but a new graph this time. We first want to find the midline. Now notice in this case, though, we have not been given the top, the middle, and the bottom lines. Well, of course, we can actually draw it in, but how to know where? Well, notice this goes up to 3 and down to negative 5. How far is it total between those? Well, that'd be 8. And so the midline then must be 4 away from the top and 4 away from the bottom, because it's got to be halfway between them. That then lets us visualize where the top, the middle, and the bottom are. Now that we have those drawn in, I can go ahead and find my midline, amplitude, and period. So the midline, remember the midline's written as y equals, and I can see here it's going to be at negative 1. The amplitude, we actually already found the amplitude when we were making sure we had the midline right. The amplitude was 4, because that's that distance from the midline to the top or the bottom of the graph. All right, next up is the period. Now the period is how long it takes to complete one full cycle. On this graph you're looking at, you actually see many cycles. We're just going to pick one of them out. Now, if I needed to pick a starting point, it makes sense usually for me to start with 0. So that's where I'll start here. And so that one starts at the top. So I then am going to go top, middle, bottom, middle, top, and that's where it would start repeating itself. So the period is that width, top to top, basically here. So in this case then, my period is going from 0 to 180. That's got to be 180 degrees then. So it's 180 degrees wide for one full cycle. That means period. All right, now a slightly different looking graph. Same 3 questions, but the graph can look a little bit different to our eyes. But we can still approach it the same kind of a way. So first up, midline and amplitude. So I want to figure out where those are. Now in this case, the midline's a little bit easier to see because our graph is only 2 units tall. Midline's got to go right through the middle of that. And so if our midline is up there, that means it's got to be at 1, 2, 3. So the midline is at y equals 3. The amplitude, notice from that midline, we're going up and down 1. So my amplitude then is 1, which just leaves the period. All right, so the period then, remember how long it takes to complete one full cycle. And I do like to start at 0 here if it's a nice, pretty number to look at. And so I start at the bottom, I then go middle, top, middle, bottom, and then that's the point at which it would start repeating itself. So to look for the period, I'm looking for the width of this part of the graph right here. Notice that part of the graph is 8 units wide because I'm going from 0 up to 8. So that then tells me my period. All right, and last up, we're going to do one more practice with this idea. Again, starting by finding midline, amplitude, and period. So for the midline, well, I need to find out what's halfway between them. You could probably eyeball it here, but if you're ever not sure, again, you can think about how tall is the wave from top to bottom. Notice that's 4. So the midline, if it's going to be halfway between them, it's got to be 2 down and 2 up. Notice our midline then, it is at y equals -1. My amplitude, that's the distance from the midline to the top or the bottom, that is 2. And now that I can see those two, now I can figure out what the period is. And again, where do we go to count our period? Well, you could count top to top, which would be here to here, but those aren't on very pretty numbers, so I'm not going to use those. You could also go bottom to bottom using the same idea, but again, those are not pretty numbers. Well, notice where I start here at 0. I'm actually starting at the midline. Okay, well, I'm going to have to use that then. So I want to see when it starts repeating itself. So I go middle, then bottom, middle. Now I'm back at the middle, but I've not started repeating myself yet. I still got to go to the top and then back to the middle, and then this is where it'd start repeating itself. So that then is going to tell my period. My period is the width of that one cycle. And so it goes from 0 up to 3, so that's got to be 3 units wide. So that is my period for this graph. It is 3.